So yeah, just thinking about how but yeah, just before we move on to those, it was really interesting. I think you referred to it as decommissioning, like decommissioning one kind of care to almost kind of allow for another kind of care and maintenance, and for those roles to change. And particularly this idea of kind of, like the shrines kind of becoming less prominent, not requiring as much maintenance, but the kind of like stewardship of the Buddhist priest kind of taking over that role, and for that to be trusted. That was fascinating, and it really reminds me of Liz's insight into how the pandemic was kind of something of a relief for Unitarians who didn't perhaps have to put so much of their time and care and attention into maintaining the impressive sort of building stock that they've got here in the UK. So I thought there were some really good parallels there. I was just wondering, like, as a scholar in this field, we've asked you, we asked you, in preparation for this talk, which you just did so well, to think about kind of maintenance as a framing. I'm really curious to know kind of how that felt for you. Like, did it feel kind of like a bit artificial? Did it feel like is this something that resonates? Like, perhaps there are kind of colleagues that speak about maintenance in this way as well. I'm really curious.
Sure. I mean, it was interesting sort of new term in a way, because I think for a long time I thought about survival, I guess, and kind of what surviving in crisis means. But then when I thought about maintenance has this notion of, on one hand, preservation and continuity, and on the other hand, it has this very instrumental, maybe, or practical element of, okay, but how are we going to practically make it happen? Like, what does it mean? So there is aspiration element of maintenance to me, and the imaginary of it too. But on the other hand is kind of practicalities of deliverance. And I think it did, once I started to kind of unpack it, maybe that way, it started resonating a lot, where we try to find a bridge, when I'm trying to find a bridge between what people might want or strive for, even if it's not possible. Because I think for many of people I've worked with, they have this very strong sense that future might actually not be possible. The future as is, even the future as is problematic. So they kind of every day trying to think, okay, the post office closed, but we still have a school, right? So what is the bare minimum to keep or to maintain community, right? Or maintain community spirit, to maintain connections. And a lot of people actually use that language of connection. And that's why it pushed me to think with interdependence. And I think that maintenance has that notion that it is about creating continuity, and that something concrete has to persevere. And I think that's why before I was asking that question about space, whether we need those kind of material connections in order for maintenance to make sense. And I think it's also maybe a question back to you, Naomi, working with technology. Is it, right? But technology is quite instrumental, even though connections might feel virtual or online or remote. So I don't know. Sorry, I'm kind of philosophizing too much here. But yeah, I think I enjoyed it. It was a new way of, it pushed me in a good direction, I think.
Well, thank you so much. Like, really wonderful talk. Thank you. I'll think about your question, but whilst I think about it, I'm going to call on Liz. I think she's got her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm really interested to hear about those rituals that come with the endings of things, of the, what you described with the empty house, of, releasing the spirits so that the house can be demolished. And it just felt so wise to recognize the need for that And the link that I just shared in the chat to the Stewarding Loss project, if you haven't come across it, I think you'll find it really interesting. They've put together a kind of a toolkit for organizations that are ending so that they can end well. And a big part of that is about ritual, recognizing that there needs, there's the practical things to do with endings, which need to be taken care of, the actually demolishing the house. Yeah. But those emotional things, we carry those connections with us. It's not just the practical work of closing something. It is, what does it feel like? How do we make it feel okay? How do we take care of the emotional sides of things so that we feel like the work is done to close that. So it was, just really beautiful to hear that example. And then also the graveyard of graveyards of I think what I liked about that was the kind of acknowledgement that there will be times when people can't continue to care for something, rather than that feeling like a shameful thing or a problem. It's like, okay, this happens. Let's put something in place to take care of this when it's no longer possible to continue caring for something in the same way. So I just, really was fascinated to learn of those examples, really. And I guess I'm just interested in, do you see that in other places as well? We've heard about this very specific context, but do you see it elsewhere as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important element in a lot of Asian traditions. And I'm kind of generalizing, so I have to be very careful here. But I think this idea that objects, and we have seen this movement also in anthropology, we're thinking about objects actually having lives of their own and having kind of, not only like with the Japanese context, the fact that there is this kind of spiritual presence within certain objects, like Butsudan, or like the grave, because that's where the kind of the spirit of the dead person is enshrined. But also the objects themselves, because they carry our attachments, our gratitude towards the object. So, for instance, in Japan, you have rituals of the rituals of separation. They called kuyo, and some people call it commemoration rituals. But what they meant to do is to create a separation, create a degree of closure, like what you say. And there are rituals to kind of, they both kind of gratitude and separation. So, for instance, there are rituals like that for needles, for instance. So people who professionally work with needles. You have certain shrines in Japan that would specialize, where you go and you have that ritual done for your tools, right, that are important. But we're seeing it also in other places. There is some great work done in India with Buddhist and Hindu statue carvers who don't want to carve when you ask them, when is the statue done? It's when the eyes are carved, because the statue sees. Right, there's an opening, and I think there is. So normally, you would have with every Buddhist statue, you would have a ceremony to open, so to welcome the spirit, and you would have a closing ceremony, so closing of the eyes. So in terms of the Asian context, those rituals, those practices are actually really, really important. Or burning items is also releasing. So therefore you would have, but what's interesting, I think, with Butsudan is that people don't just take it to the yard, chop it up and burn it. They feel the need, that there is a need for kind of the ritual release, that they don't have the kind of the spiritual, the religious competence to deliver. Even though the ritual burning is usually the kind of the final moment. I think, am I answering your question? Am I?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I just find it so fascinating to think. I guess it feels like those kind of practices are not very common in Britain today, but it feels like there's so much value. I think quite often it would feel like, well, that's not a very rational thing to do. But like what you say about the attachment and the emotions, like, well, those are real things. Those are feelings towards an object or a tool, like you said. It's, you know, it's very real. And so acknowledging those, I guess, non-material elements, it just feels like it's so valuable. It's something I'm really interested in. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for your comments, Liz, as well.
So I wondered, it was really fascinating to hear about the structure of kind of households and societies involved in maintenance and around, you know, all of those different roles. And with this idea of kind of, you know, the aging population, I wondered if you might be able to kind of briefly contrast the sort of Japanese social and cultural practices with those that we see in Western Europe around maintenance activity. So, you know, typically people involved in kind of, you know, maintenance activity tend to be, you know, like older people, you know, the over 65s and over, supporting charities, local communities, community gardens, things like that. Although I think part of that is to do with I think part of that is to do with quite a limited sort of idea of what maintenance is. So, you know, so that aside, but I wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on how that might change or evolve, given, you know, what you've learned in Japan.
Sure. I mean, there is definitely demographic dominance of elderly people doing both the community work that is required through kind of neighborhood associations. And there is some really detailed statistical evidence for that. So who's kind of maintaining the community structures, mainly elderly, mainly retired, so 65 plus. So that dominating group, if you will. And at the moment, we have abundance of 65 plus in Japan. So all of this work is happening. But there is also an element that people from younger generations, the way labor market works in Japan, they actually don't have free time to do volunteering, whether it's within a religious context or whether it is within a kind of the social context. So there is this big kind of generational gap that is not being filled. And I think there is the passing of knowledge is also problematic. And we're seeing it also in heritage restoration, which heritage is another element that another thing that I work on, that we have the same issue in terms of passing the knowledge of maintenance of restorative work. And that's why partially Japan is pushing so strongly for the intangible, for the UNESCO intangible heritage status for things like maintaining of the thatched houses, right, or some of the woodwork and some of these other stuff, because there isn't that generational transference, and therefore it kind of is a way of trying to protect it. But the problem there is, once you solidify it with UNESCO status, there is no space for organic change to those maintenance practices either.
I see, that it kind of ossifies it almost.
Because you can't change it, right? It has the status, elevated status for a particular reason. But I also don't want to maybe dominate the conversation by saying that kind of elderly are running Japan, because that's also not the case. And there are a lot of, for instance, art initiatives where younger people are going into rural areas and transform all these abandoned houses into kind of artwork pieces to try and kind of create some sort of alternative communities, or they come together because you can get these houses for free if you move into the rural area. So if anyone wants to move into rural Japan, let me know. You could get a house for free if you stay.
Don't tempt me, honestly.
Yeah, if you stay. But you have also these kind of younger generations of people moving out of cities because they become disillusioned with this kind of pressure, and therefore they want to move back into the rural context, but the kind of rural life they want to maintain is different. So like when I mentioned the tension with not wanting to flush their fields, so they kind of come with much more kind of environmentally friendly practices, kind of ecological cosmologies that they try to enact, the way they try to build community that has nothing to do with these sort of established structures. So it's not to say they're not absent, they just don't want to tap in to that process. But in terms of the kind of community-based volunteering with the established community structures, it's definitely dominated by the elderly. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Paulina. Yeah, Richard's just mentioned in the chat that around, Richard leads a course around the future of heritage, I believe. You've posted a couple of helpful links there in terms of this idea of, what in terms of kind of maintaining those maintenance practices, I suppose.
Skills that are required to actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And George has posted a couple of links over there as well.
I'll be opening them up furiously in a moment.
Excellent. That's what we're here for. So we were interested also in this idea of the temple as an idea of an example of kind of public and private space. We wondered kind of to what extent do the members of the community feel ownership of the temple? Is a sense of ownership required, or is that too simplistic a framing? Is that what incentivizes the types of maintenance that happen there? If not, how are people incentivized to do this kind of maintenance practice?
Sure. So yes, there is a shared sense of ownership, but there are tensions when it comes to the practicalities of financing certain things, or not financing certain things. So you have very formal structures. So on one hand, you have formal structures that are socioeconomical. So every household belongs, every household pays annual membership fees. And there are members of the boards who together with the priests might decide on something or another. So in principle, the building is owned by the community. So for instance, if the priest doesn't have a successor and the community wanted to bring someone else, they would kick out the temple family. It sounds very harsh, but in principle, they can do that because so it very much also depends on the relationship that the priest has with the community. They really have to work hard at kind of nurturing the sense of, belonging to the community. And also show up for community work, for instance, right? So if you don't show up, why should we show up? But they have this whole calendar of events that relate to temple maintenance, and that is prescribed. It's there. And people have to show up. There are very complicated rotas. The entire kind of village is divided into quarters and it rotates who's responsible for what. But also with aging, when I was there in 2017, these sort of communities within the village, they pulled out their membership from the temple board because they said, we just don't have people to do all of these maintenance works, the cleaning works. We can't finance any of those activities. So they actually pulled out because they said we can't actually do it. So there is that structure. But then on the other hand, people also feel they have this very emotional kind of affective relationship with the temple, where temple is seen as something, okay, we still have a post office, we still have a school, we still have an operational temple. It's kind of seen as this, okay, the cogs are still working. The shop closed down, but that's okay. We can mitigate that. So there is that imaginary that temple is something of a responsibility of the community. But there are also tensions because the way Buddhist temple families see it, they see it, it's the home. And the temple kitchen, for instance, is open to everyone, right? The temple hall is open to everyone. So technically, people should be able to come in and out. And there is a lot of tension coming from the community where people are saying, I no longer feel welcome. I no longer just go and open the door to the temple hall and go and pray because they're keeping it private. And in truth, the temple where I lived, they actually built an annex that they funded with their own money, not temple money, that is their family living quarters. to make sure that the parishioners don't come in and sort of nose around and that sort of things. So there is a way of trying to, like, there is a sense of co-ownership and accountability for sure, because you can't really restore anything unless people support you financially and feel that sense that, you know what, because I was meant to have that image, but one of the things that you have, any donation to the temple is recorded with the name of the household and the amount, and it's mounted on the roof of the temple and on the walls. So it's very visible. But some people give a lot of money, but they don't want to be recorded because they don't want their neighbors to know that they have this strong emotional connection to the temple. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there is a combination of the two. And maybe there is another example that I'm going to briefly just raise. There is another temple. They have a Buddhist statue that is recognized prefectural heritage. It has recognized prefectural heritage status, so kind of not national level, but kind of prefectural important heritage. But they have about 80 households supporting that temple. Normally in Japan, you need about 300 households supporting you to maintain the operational temple. In Hiroshima, you can probably survive with about 120 households, but they have 80, but this is the entire community, that's it. And they have members of other faiths in that community, but they support the temple. They can't restore the statue, but they use the story of the statue. The statue is not looking so great, but they can't restore it. But they use the story of that statue to kind of say, listen, we can't restore it, but this is an important, this is our history. It dates back to when the statue arrived here in the 13th century. We have to keep this temple alive. The head priest of that temple is dead. They don't actually, and his wife and daughter are still living there. And another temple is sort of, head priest is stepping in to kind of maintain the religious life of the community, if you will, every now and again. But the community is still pulling together to like bring the food, repair stuff when possible, and kind of pulling together to be like, no, we need this thing to survive. They also have a school which altogether across 6 years has 25 students.
Really? Wow. Okay.
So it's that kind of, you know, when I was talking about the parameters of what is still possible, it's like, no, we can keep this school going. We don't.
I see. Yeah. It's a different scale.
Yeah. And if you think about it, it's like, is that it? Amazing. Right? So amazing, but also scary for them. Yeah.
Yeah, quite daunting, I imagine.
So I think there is that emotional response as well to potential vanishing. And I think that kicks in some communities more than others. And that sense of co-stewardship, co-ownership becomes stronger as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to, we've got one more question, I think, from Zarino, who is our co-host. So I'm going to mute myself and hand over to Zarino to ask our final question before we break for lunch.
All right, cool. Sorry, we're both in the same room, so we're making sure we don't have some feedback issues. I think later today we're going to be hearing from George Oates about Flickr Foundation's work to preserve information or like culture, really, for centuries to come. And I saw she shared a link in the chat already to like the Long Now and stuff. I'm kind of interested, like, to what extent the maintenance you've experienced in these temples is focused on like that massively long term, because these temples have been around for an incredibly long time. So you could look back a really long way. Are the communities involved in these temples looking forward that far? Are they thinking about that really long term? Or, as you said, is it more about surviving, as you termed it, just like for the here and now, just like fix that thing before it falls down, and do whatever makes sense right now for my lifetime? Or to what extent do they think about multiple generations forward?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Thank you. And I think there is paradoxically a mix of both. It's kind of this contingency planning for now, but against all kind of reason, and kind of when you're looking at the trend, you're like thinking, seriously, how are these imaginaries still so strong? But the imaginaries of next generation are there. Weirdly, most of the, and I think this is something that I found shocking when I first went into the field, because I went into the field with this idea of Buddhism being in crisis, the population is just obliterating all the communities, they're dying out, and there are loads of temple communities that are closing, 100%. But then I found this really active way of imagining future that might never come to be. But the strength is in the imagining, not, and we were chatting sort of in a private chat with Phoebe as well, is about this kind of strength of imagination, is that it's almost like, it almost doesn't matter that it won't come to exist, but they are imagining the next generation, or they are mitigating against the potential failures of the next generation to do things right. And one example of that is, for instance, you know how Buddhism in Japan is about this continuity of death-related rites, commemorating your dead, keeping that kind of karmic connection going. So there are a lot of, and especially women, who are making a decision and asking the local priests to say, I want you to store my ashes at the temple, like create like a little storage. They called nokotsudo, so like storage for columbaria, I guess would be the English word for it. And they say, that's where I want to store it. And they create these little photo albums of the life stories, because if you look at the family histories in Japan, women are sort of exited from the fathers. It's called koseki, which keeps the record of the family. Women are exited and then they are put into their husband. But then one of my friends showed me her koseki and said, like, look, that's it. I gave birth, end of my story. So they create these stories to kind of keep, and they write about the life of community, their own life. And they say, I want this stored with my ashes at the temple. And I'm thinking, and I'm asking, so you think the temple will survive? And it's like, well, they on the 14th generation of the priest. If they won't make it, who will? Right? So there is that sense of thinking, okay, someone has to make it. And if not me, not my children, we have to think of ways of imagining that, or securing future in a way. So I think it's the tension between the two. On one hand, very openly saying, I don't think my kids will do this, so I have to find a way. But I think these guys just might, because, come on, you know, they've been here for 300 years, their family root is traceable, and if they can't make it, they will merge with another temple, they will figure it out. So it's interesting to see those kind of, dead-end imaginaries, maybe, but they have potential. So I guess, because otherwise, if you don't have anything to strive for, then why would you even try, right? If Shimane is your future, which it is, but you know what I mean. It's it's kind of having that vision that sustains something else. Does that?
That's really interesting. Yeah. As someone with a digital background, I'm suddenly like trying to imagine who are the sort of the high priests that we could donate all of our stuff to. And obviously there are examples of this, like Wikipedia and archive.org and Flickr Foundation we're going to hear about. But that's really, really interesting to see that they've both got an eye on the very far future and just the faith, I guess, that people will make the right decision in the future if we set them up in the right way right now. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of trust, right, as well, that kind of trusting that something can be done, that the maintenance is possible somehow, somewhere. Yeah, I don't know.